In this video, we'll talk about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, starting with the central nervous system. The nervous system can be thought of as the brain's communication network that consists of all nerve cells. The central nervous system is the part of the body's communication network that is encased in bone. The brain is inside the skull, and the spinal cord is inside the spine. The central nervous system is also the portion of the nervous system most associated with processing sensory information. It then sends electrochemical signals out to the peripheral nervous system for physical movements and actions. This slide shows two neurons separated by a synapse, circled in red at the top of the image. On the left side is the first neuron, which has a nucleus and some longer, stringy, tentacle-looking things called dendrites, circled in yellow. On the right side is the second neuron. You can see that they each have a body, which is called the soma. A simple explanation of the way that neurons talk to each other is that the electrical charge builds up. This is called the action potential, circled in orange. The action potential is not part of the physical anatomy of the atom. The action potential is the electrical charge that is fired down the axon, the tail of the neuron, circled in green, toward the synapse, which is, again, the small gap between the neurons. The fatty myelin sheath on the axon serves to speed up the action potential. The signal then crosses the synaptic gap and builds the electrochemical charge in the second neuron, which then repeats the process. In this way, the signal makes its way from one neuron to another. And the signal always goes in the same direction from neuron to neuron. It starts on the receiving end with the dendrites picking up the signal, passing it through the soma or body of the neuron, through the axon, towards the tail of the neuron, crossing the synapse to the dendrites of the next neuron. And in case you were wondering, the tail of each neuron also has stringy tentacle-looking things which have terminal buttons, and we'll get a closer look at that on the next slide, along with a close-up of the synapse. But first, I want to pause here and reflect on this, because this intercellular communication is the basis of all that we know and all that we do. Every single thought, every single action, movement, memory, emotion, sensation, goal, or motivation, literally everything we do is based here in the electrical communication between these types of cells. I think that's such a cool thing. All of what we are and all of what we do can be found here. Now, this slide basically shows a close-up of communication between neurons. As I mentioned on the last slide, the communication flows from the tail of one neuron to the head of the next. So the tail of the neuron has what we call terminal buttons that send the signal to the dendrites of the next neuron. And remember how I said that the communication is electrical? It's actually electrochemical, because tiny particles that we call neurotransmitters are actually jumping from one neuron to the next one. When a neuron fires, it emits neurotransmitters across the synapse, which then get absorbed by the dendrites of the next neuron. Now, if you're wondering, there are different types of neurons. Sensory neurons take in information from our contact with the environment. Say, for example, when you touch a hot stove, your CNS really needs to know this fast, and sensory neurons get that information there. Motor neurons send signals to the body to move and perform other actions like sweating or arousal. Interneurons carry signals between neurons. Then we have glial cells, which get an honorable mention. They're not actually neurons. They don't carry signals, but instead they support, nourish, and protect neurons. They are about 10 times as many glial cells as neurons. They fill the space between neurons, serving as the mortar or glue and thus hold neural tissue together. What's cool about the nervous system is that we have movements that are not only involuntary, but actually don't require a signal to or from the brain in order to happen. A reflex arc is a neural pathway that controls a reflex. Most sensory neurons do not pass directly into the brain, but rather within the spinal cord. This allows for faster reflex actions to occur by activating spinal motor neurons without the delay of routing signals through the brain. The brain will receive the signal more as a status update while the reflex is being carried out, and the brain's analysis of the signal takes place after the reflex action. This happens when you go to the doctor and they strike that triangle-shaped thing on your knee, and your leg just shoots forward, and then only a second later does your brain fully process what happened. And if you're curious to see the different anatomy of these different types of neurons, here are some artist depictions of what they look like. Motor neurons have a cell body on one end, a long axon in the middle and dendrites on the other. Sensory neurons have dendrites on both ends, connected by a shorter axon with a cell body in the middle. Humans have about 500,000 motor neurons and about 10 million sensory neurons. The average human brain contains 86 billion neurons in total. It is also not the case that we only use 10% of our brain. That's a myth that likely started to imply that we have untapped potential. Modern neuroimaging research has shown that we use all parts of our brain just at different times, and certainly more than 10% at any given time. Now, remember, we briefly talked about neurotransmitters, which are the tiny chemicals that actually physically jump from neuron to neuron. Let's talk a bit more about neurotransmitters. Neurons become active based on the information they get from neurotransmitters, which are either excitatory or inhibitory. Excitatory neurotransmitters activate the receptors on the receiving neuron and enhance the action potential, while inhibitory neurotransmitters prevent an action potential. So basically, neurotransmitters can make it more or less likely that a receiving neuron will become active. Sometimes we have other substances introduced which influence the power of neurotransmitters to have an effect on neurons. Agonists increase and antagonists reduce the amount of neurotransmitters available to send signals between neurons. This is how some medicines work. It's also how poisons work. Curare, for example, is a natural poison used by indigenous peoples in South America while hunting. It's an antagonist, which means that it acts as a neuromuscular blocking agent and prevents nerve impulses from activating skeletal muscles. It binds to acetylcholine receptors. Acetylcholine, or ACH, is a neurotransmitter, a chemical that carries messages from your brain to your body through nerve cells. When this gets blocked by a poison like curare, an animal can become paralyzed. In contrast to poisons, some medicinal agonists include drugs like Ritalin or cocaine, increasing the availability of neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, which has the effect of increasing arousal, wakefulness, or concentration. In contrast to the central nervous system, we also have the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. This is a complex network of nerves that travel to every part of the body. As your textbook notes, some of what we do with the PNS also involves conscious choices, like when you're writing a letter to your friend and you need to coordinate thoughts and physical hand movements while you're typing on your computer. This would fall under the somatic nervous system on the left side of the bracket. By contrast, involuntary movements like your digestive system fall under autonomic nervous system, which is on the right side of the bracket. The somatic nervous system has sensory and motor neuron pathways because it deals with muscles and movement, so it must take into account sensory input, whereas the autonomic nervous system only has motor neuron pathways because it deals with inner bodily organs and glands. Furthermore, the autonomic nervous system can be subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic system controls fight or flight or emergency survival responses. In other words, this system prepares the body for stressful and strenuous physical activity. The parasympathetic system, by contrast, is more relaxed and regulates the, quote, rest and digest functions. These images display different actions involved with the different peripheral nervous system functions. On the top left, the person is relaxing in a pool, so this is parasympathetic. On the top right and bottom left, these are the flight and fight responses, respectively, so they are both sympathetic. And then on the bottom right, we have writing a letter, which is somatic.